Right, hello folks, and welcome back to Remember the Regulars. I am finally getting back on with the little invasion threat series that started a while back, where we took a look at the true extent of the German invasion threats. And now we're going to kind of move on to the forgotten perspective, which is that of the home forces. So like I say, as a specialist in this field, it surprises me that the perspective of the invasion threat is always from the enemy perspective and never from the defender's perspective. And again, one of the points of why I set up this channel and I'm doing these videos is to demonstrate the role of the regular and territorial army and therefore the home forces during the Second World War, because their perspective and their history is not widely overlooked, but also rarely researched as well. And the aim of these videos is to kind of show you the actual reaction to the invasion threats from the defender's perspective. So we're going to start off. I was initially going to do these in like one big kind of video, but I think the more logical way of doing this, because the invasion threats changed quite a lot throughout the Second World War, I thought the best way of doing this is to kind of do it chronologically. So, quite surprisingly to, I'm sure, many viewers, we're starting in 1939 and going to go into early 1940. So, the common perspective or the common knowledge today is that invasion didn't rear its head until 1940, where that's not actually true in any way, shape, or form. Especially from the Home Forces perspective. So, from the Home Forces perspective, the invasion threat, as we'll see in this video, reared its head just over a month after war was declared. And this is again something that's overlooked. It's not until like the fall of France and the south coast becoming vulnerable that the invasion threat is given any attention. But the reality is that the south coast, as I like to say, was very late to the party when it came to the invasion threat. So let's start with 1939, and yeah, we'll lead into early 1940 because this gives us a really nice cut-off point in terms of the defensive strategies employed. So with this video, I'm going to try and stick to a script. So if there's points where I kind of go a bit robotic, that's probably because I'm reading off a bit of text I've got on the side of my screen over here. But I always like to try and keep these ad lib and try to have it more kind of like a more relaxed presentation, like you're talking to me down the pub or something like that. But yeah, like I say, if my voice does change and I start to go a bit kind of robotic, that's the point where I'm reading off a bit of paper. Right, so let's start with sources. So, as always with this, reading off the script time, the aim of these videos is to demonstrate the history of the invasion threats by using primary sources. And the aim of this is to make it clear what these sources are throughout the presentation. So I'm not just, I want to make it abundantly clear that I'm not just quoting opinion or whatever. I am stating my assessment based on these primary sources that I've consulted. And as I go through this video, you'll see at the bottom of the screen that I'm quoting these sources. But yeah, the main reason for doing this is to show that I'm not just making things up. I am using period documents to form an opinion and form an analysis rather than just stating opinion or something based on secondary sources and the work of others. And I'm able, by doing this, I'm then able to prove or back up what I'm saying with a source of information, in particular primary or period document. And the main documentary sources I'm using in this video are the war diaries and the command files. So these are two sets of kind of overarching files which are held in the National Archives in London. And these have given me a vital insight into the invasion threat in this period from 1939 up until, let's say, early 1940. And as I said, if you look at the bottom of the slides where applicable, you'll see the references for these sources that I've quoted at the bottom of the page, or the bottom of the screen, in the little box at the bottom. Right, what have we got next? So, whenever I do a presentation on anti-invasion defences, or pillboxes or whatever, I always like to start with an assessment of the chronology to give the background history, because this is so poorly understood that I think it's always best to kind of start with a chronology of events. And then I also provide an assessment of the invasion threats to demonstrate that it wasn't just the South Coast that was vulnerable to invasion. So I do this again chronologically. And one of the things that always kind of comes out of this is that like I've already said, a lot of people think that the invasion threat only focused on the south coast, when the reality is the entirety of the country's coastline was vulnerable. But at the outbreak of war, this wasn't necessarily so. It took up until mid 1940 for the entirety of the country's coastline to become vulnerable. Um, so, and as a result of this, whenever I mention this online, that the invasion threat from like Norway, for example, or Denmark, and the threat to the Shetland Isles, this is often dismissed out of hand with, no consideration for the fact that this is what the Home Forces were reacting to from their perspective. So a lot of people seem to have a hard time grasping that today we know the German invasion plans were to hit the south coast and elsewhere if you look at part one, but a lot of people don't quite grasp that the Home Forces didn't know this, and as such they were having to react to what were a wide range of sources of information and intelligence and use this to determine their defensive strategy. So they didn't just go, oh well, the Germans are going to hit the south coast, we'll just defend there. They had various sources of information which put the invasion threat as happening across the country. And this intelligence picture changed frequently as well. So they were constantly reacting to an ever-changing intelligence picture, which then was used to influence their plans. Another kind of contributing factor to one of the reasons why people seem to misunderstand the invasion threats is that because obviously little research has actually been done into the Home Forces, and the plans of the Home Forces are rarely actually presented or understood or analysed in any way, shape or form. So yeah, whenever I show this slide, which is straight out of my presentation or one of my presentations, I almost always get some kind of pushback in the form of like, oh, the Germans wouldn't have done that, which is often if I post this or mention stuff online, straight away someone will go, oh, no, the Germans weren't going to invade from Norway or whatever. But that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant if you think the Germans weren't going to invade from northern Germany or Norway or whatever. It's completely irrelevant because, the Germans might not have been planning to do that, but this is the perception of the Home Forces, the defence force that was defending the UK. So whether you think the Germans were going to do it or not is completely irrelevant. This is what I'm presenting here is the reaction to the intelligence picture that the Home Forces put into operation. So the invasion threats, to kind of reiterate, are rarely perceived as they were by the Home Forces, and the kind of defensive assessment of the invasion threats changed in light of things like German troop movements, invasions of other countries like Norway and Denmark, for example, and France, and other military actions. So the invasion threat itself was actually very fluid. When we come into like 1940, you get, especially in some of the war diaries I'm looking at, you get these intelligence reports which are issued on a weekly and sub-weekly basis. In some cases, every day these were issued, which give an assessment of the intelligence picture to try and inform division and battalion commanders as to what was going on and what might happen. So the intelligence picture was fluid. It was constantly changing and was constantly being reassessed by the Home Forces at various levels, not just the Commander-in-Chief, every single level of the Home Forces. And then therefore this information was then constantly being reacted to in the form of changing defensive strategies. So there wasn't just one defensive strategy employed and then that was it. This defensive strategy, as we'll see in this video, changed over time, and it changed relatively frequently. So using these primary sources, I want to demonstrate as clearly as possible in the form of period military documents that the threat of invasion wasn't focused solely on the south coast, as is often believed. And I also want to demonstrate that the intelligence picture and therefore the defensive strategy changed relatively frequently. And I'm just going to reiterate again, because I like saying this, the south coast was late to the invasion party, when it eventually came under threat in mid-1940. Right, let's get into the meat and potatoes. So, October 1939 to early 1940 is largely defined by what was termed the Julius Caesar Plan. This was the first plan of invasion defence that was presented in October 1939. So war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939. I should really know that. And this scheme of defence was put into operation towards the end of October 1939. So you can say just over a month after war was declared, the first plan of invasion defence was implemented. So this initial plan provides an assessment of the threat of invasion and the likely course of action of the enemy in October 1939, so just a month after war was declared. And it also provides a scheme of defence against this threat as well. So I'm not going to go into much detail in terms of the schemes of defence, because that is something that's going to require its own series to look at, and I'll do that much later down the line, is do a series looking at the these invasion threat, not the invasion threats, the defensive plans in more detail, because they deserve their own focus in their own right. So, you know, in these videos, I will literally just be focusing on the invasion threat as it was presented in the Julius Caesar plan. So, there is an associated document that was drafted to outline the Julius Caesar plan, and this outlines the initial plans that have been produced. What it says on the spur of the moment. But had since been subject to considerable modification, and that, you know, in October 1939 it was determined that it was the right time to actually set out this plan in a compact and handy form, as the document says. So it doesn't actually demonstrate or outline what happened or what changed to see the Julius Caesar plan drawn up from what was an ad hoc, you know, plan drawn up on the back of a fag packet probably, to a properly considered defensive strategy or defensive plan. So, you know, it's quite odd, but it was clearly seen that in October 1939 that there was a likelihood that invasion would take place a month after war was declared. And I'm going to also state as well that this Julius Caesar plan remained in place from about October 1939, when it was initially put together, all the way through to about April 1940, after which a serious reconsideration was undertaken. But there's going to be more on that in this series later on, because, like I say, this change from the Julius Caesar plan to the subsequent plan needs to have its own proper consideration. So, yeah, this is just an excerpt from the Julius Caesar plan. So the source is there at the bottom, which was one of the command files. And this states that the Commander-in-Chief of Foreign Forces was called upon to prepare immediate plans to meet an invasion on a large scale based on a course of enemy action which had been ruled out as unlikely. So, coming into October 1939, this is the period where, you know, this, as I've just stated, this on the spur of the moment plan was put into action and bulks out for some reason, you know, and it makes it very clear in this statement here that, you know, the course of enemy action initially was determined to be unlikely, but the threat of a large-scale invasion was seen on the 27th of October to actually be potential or likely to happen, and as a result of that, these initial plans were actually drawn up into something much more serious. So, as part of this initial plan, I personally don't like to use a lot of slides with a lot of text on them, but I've had to make a change here for that, because this is quite important to get out. So, this document outlines, or the initial version of the Julius Caesar plan outlines the airborne threat and the seaborne threat, along with some other things. But it's worth considering first splitting these into two to consider what was the airborne threat. So this is something that goes, again, as always, completely overlooked. So the assessment, or the information available to the Commander-in-Chief of Foreign Forces on the 27th of October 1939 provided the following assessment of the airborne threat. So the Commander-in-Chief at this time was General Walter Kirk, and he was in post from the outbreak of war all the way up until May, I think it was May, I'm going to say 15th of May 1940. And the information he had available suggested that the enemy had around 4,000 trained parachutists. And the aim, the idea or the belief was that these could be used to seize an aerodrome or aerodromes, which could then be used to bring in further troop-carrying aircraft to bolster this initial drop of 4,000 trained parachutists or parachute troops. They also assessed that at this point the enemy had about 1,000 civil aircraft, each capable of carrying about 15 men and possessing the required range to fly from northern Germany and drop parachute troops in the area closest to northern Germany, which was most likely East Anglia. It doesn't elaborate on that. But it's also the assessment here that there were only 6,000 air landing troops trained as such as well. So again, I can't corroborate this this information because I've not looked into the German files, but this was what the home forces thought the enemy had in terms of airborne troops. And this is their initial assessment of what they thought was most vulnerable to airborne invasion. So the initial worry was on the 27th of October 1939 that the enemy could use parachutists to capture an aerodrome, and this aerodrome could then be used to bring in troop carrying aircraft to bring in more arms and equipment. So this is what the documents tell me. And this is their invasion, how the invasion threat was outlined. It was also elsewhere in the document outlined that Germany had 1,750 long-range bombers that could be used to operate from Germany, as well, so provided some form of air support or air cover. But it also makes it very clear here as well in the document that this number would more like, or would need to be bolstered in some way by additional aircraft operating from airfields in Holland. And it also makes clear as well that dive bombers, for example, required to neutralise the Navy, the Royal Navy, would also require Dutch airfields due to their short range. So they're kind of preempting at this point what happened in May, June, July 1940. Which is really quite interesting. So they are already assessing the potential for the invasion of Holland to be used to provide air cover for an invading force invading East Anglia. I'm going to surmise East Anglia in this case because that was the closest point to northern Germany. It doesn't state this explicitly, but it's more than likely that this is what they're hinting at because that's the most accessible point in terms of location, in terms of proximity to the UK or the British coast. Right, so that's their assessment in October 1939 of the airborne threat. Next we come to the seaborne threat. So again, this is what, based on the information that the C&C of Home Forces, Walter Kirk, had available to him on the 27th of October 1939, and this information was used to back up the Julius Caesar plan. So at this point, in terms of seaborne threat, it was believed that the enemy could embark a division. So about, what's the division? 18,000 troops. The British Army had 18,000 troops in a division. Don't know about the Germans, probably something similar. And it was believed that they could embark a division in 20 transports, each of 4,000 to 5,000 tons. It was estimated that the crossing could take 20 hours at the speed of 15 knots before they made contact with the, see here we go, the nearest point of the British coast, so most likely Norfolk, East Anglia, sailing from ports in northern Germany. And it was also determined that this force could be escorted by as many as 25 to 30 modern destroyers. So this was their assessment of the invasion force. So October 1939, they believed that a division, 18,000 troops, could be deployed or embarked on 20 transports, and they could sail within 20 hours and make landfall on the UK coast. It's also worth pointing out here as well that they considered that a landing was hardly possible during winter weather conditions, but it was more likely the enemy transports would enter a port previously captured by parachute troops. So again, they're surmising that it's most likely that the Germans will use paratroops to either capture airfields or airfields and a port from which the enemy could embark, or sorry, disembark in this case, a landing force from ships. So really, really interesting stuff here. So this, provides an insight into their thinking at the time. It's also at this point where they, within this initial Julius Caesar plan document from October, that they provide a feasibility statement as to how feasible the invasion threat was. So this assessment of the feasibility of an invasion outlines the airborne force itself would need to be quickly supported and maintained by the sea, given the lack of arms and ammunition and the lack of staying power of such force, or such a force would possess. So airborne troops are relatively lightly armed, so they often only have small arms and potentially air-landed light artillery, and this force would need to be backed up by a seaborne force, which is interesting because earlier in this assessment they say that the airborne force would need to capture an airfield force supply as well. So it's interesting, there is a bit of disparity in, or difference in how things are assessed. And it also says here as well in the feasibility statement, the seaborne force itself would also take time to disembark via a port, and it was estimated that it would take them actually several days to land a division at a port such as Harwich. So it was also estimated that the home forces themselves would be able to provide the defenders, so the home forces, with a minimum of 8 hours notice of the attempted invasion, which is quite interesting as a stat. So they would have had about eight hours preparation time to, for the troops that were deployed to counter this threat to get ready for the invasion to turn up. I'm at the point now where I can't remember what my next slide is. So here we go. Right, so that was the feasibility statement. What does the document tell us about what was deemed to be the most vulnerable areas? And this is where things get interesting or become very interesting. So I'm surmising from what the document states that, obviously we know the Germans in October 1939 didn't occupy the lowland countries, Denmark or Norway. So it has to be surmised that this assessment was made considering ports in northern Germany and the North German coast. Obviously, there is some speculation here that the Germans would need to capture airfields in Holland, for example, to support or provide air cover to this invading force. But this is what the document outlines. Excuse me. In terms of the most vulnerable ports. So the document outlines that obviously the Germans would need to, or it's assessed or surmised that they would capture a port first and use that to land a fleet. And the two most vulnerable ports are determined to be the Humber and Harwich. So in terms of the Humber, you've got Immingham and Blythe and Immingham port, and you've also got Hull docks as well, which are, it doesn't state explicitly, it just says Humber, but that's what you can surmise. And then Harwich as well, and Harwich was already mentioned in the text as, the place that it would take several days to land a division at the port of Harwich, for example. So these are the key areas that are deemed vulnerable to invasion where it comes to vulnerable ports. The document also outlines potential landing places where the Germans could invade as well. And these are really interesting because you've also got Lowestoft, Ramsgate, and also Scotland, Aberdeen and Dundee highlighted as places where the Germans could potentially also land troops as part of an invasion as well. So again, this is something that's overlooked, but this is the initial assessment as well. So yeah, that hopefully gives you an insight into this initial Julius Caesar plan, or the initial threats of invasion as they were determined as of October 1939. This plan, as I've already mentioned earlier on, the plan for invasion, or the Julius Caesar plan's threat assessment was, the threat assessments were constantly changing. They were constantly in a state of flux, and the home forces were constantly reacting to new intelligence and new information that was coming in. And as a result of this, the Julius Caesar plan's assessment was further refined in November 1939. So less than a month after it was initially issued, it was refined further to kind of to take into account some further information that had come in and additional assessment that had been undertaken. So on the 15th of November 1939, the method of invasion was revised. It was at this point that it was surmised that airborne troops would now be used to seize airfields as well as suitable landing beaches or even a harbour immediately prior to a seaborne invasion taking place. And these parachute troops could also be used to put fighter airfields out of action. So it's at this point in November that the Home Forces are now considering that the Germans might try to knock out fighter and bomber command within the invasion area, which is extremely interesting. So they're thinking that the enemy is going to try and knock out airfields to help support the German air cover. And yeah, this is really interesting. So it's determined at this point as well that an initial body of seaborne troops would comprise of 20,000 enemy troops. So I think that's about a division in the German army, not 100% sure, but that's an interesting that they've gone from saying a division to specifically 20,000 enemy troops. Could be transported by 20 to 25 ships, so that's not changed, of around 5,000 tons. So no longer 4,000 to 5,000, they are stating specifically that the ships would need to be 5,000 tons. And what's really interesting now is that by November, the assessment of how long this fleet would take to travel from northern Germany has been further refined. So they say, so the Julius Caesar plan in November 1939 states that an invading force could travel at a speed of 15 knots and make landfall with the mainland UK in 12 to 14 hours. So this is much less than the projected 20 hours of the October Julius Caesar plan. Yeah, and they also state that this force could reach a point of coast projected between the Humber and the Thames within 12 to 14 hour time frame. So let's have a look at how that looks. So this is the area which it was projected in November 1939 that were most likely to be the landing areas that the Germans could reach within 12 to 14 hours of northern Germany, which is really quite interesting. So we've seen the initial assessment that the Germans could land in Dundee and Aberdeen, or what was it, Lowestoft and Ramsgate. That has been cut down quite a bit, and they are surmising that within 12 to 14 hours sailing time from northern Germany, this is the area on this map where the Germans could land. The areas of likely landing, or the most likely landing area, has also been determined as well at this point. And it's outlined in the document that the most likely landing area at this time in November 1939 was believed to be between Yarmouth and Harwich. So that's really interesting too. So this is put down to navigational difficulties in the form of friendly minefields. So friendly as in the UK forces, not the enemy. So things like friendly minefields and fixed defences on the coast would provide navigational difficulties and mean that it's most likely that the Germans would aim to land between Yarmouth and Harwich in 1939. They also state as well, the Home Forces Julius Caesar plan also states that Harwich was the only port where enemy transports could gain access. So I think it's because Yarmouth is pretty much an enclosed harbour focusing around the river that the enemy would have trouble breaching the defences and getting into that port. So Harwich was deemed to be the most likely port that the Germans would capture. At this point as well, it was still stressed though that air superiority would likely be key for an invasion, and air bases would need to be established in Holland with the country captured prior to invasion. So if invasion did come, the Home Forces believe that Holland would be invaded first and airfields either captured or established in that to provide air cover for an invasion force. It's also worth noting that the feasibility statement that was updated in November 1939 puts a massive emphasis on the importance of the enemy knocking out both fighter and bomber airfields. So it outlines that airfields would need to be captured, they would need to be bombed. All this stuff is a key consideration now, which is really interesting. So we see this refinement going on in November 1939. And as far as I'm aware so far, this plan remains in place up until this point of about early to mid 1940. So this is the assessment that remains in place for a fair amount of time, a good couple of months until the situation changes, as we'll see in the next video. So what we got next? Oh yeah, the revision to the Julius Caesar plan also outlines that the area where the Germans could land was limited by distance as well. So they didn't want to rule out that the enemy would just land within this area of Yarmouth to Harwich. They also surmised that there was the potential for additional, what they term unexpected landings outside of this area that could be made in an area from the Tyne all the way down to south of Harwich. So, but this area was limited by the distance of travel. So obviously the Germans would be trying to travel and hit an area of coast as quickly as possible, potentially during the night. And that area was assessed as being limited to nowhere further north than the Tyne, nowhere further south than Harwich, essentially. So yeah, again, we're seeing some refinement of the data and analysis that's going on in this period. Right. What have I got next? So I just wanted to provide an additional kind of perspective of this, and what I've done is gone into the war diaries here to try and pick out some of these early documents and how they tie in with the Julius Caesar plan. So this is an extract from Northern Command's war diary, and it's not going to be particularly clear on screen, but this pretty much parrots exactly what was said in the Julius Caesar plan. So it mentions the figures about 4,000 parachute troops and 1,000, 1,000 could be landed by night. So there is a bit of disparity here. Also mentioned about the 1,000 civilian transport aircraft. So Northern Command is the area from the northern extent to Norfolk all the way up to the Scottish border. So yeah, it does kind of parrot here that what is mentioned in the Julius Caesar plan. It also mentions the figure of, one division being able to voyage overnight or within 20 hours, and escorted by 20 to 30 destroyers, and it does kind of outline or copy the invasion threat as it was outlined in the Julius Caesar plan. And then providing a bit more perspective in this area of where the invasion threat was deemed most likely to appear, I've decided to look at the 18th Infantry Division, which was the division which was deployed to defend Norfolk from the outbreak of war all the way up to December 1941. At the time of the Julius Caesar plan, the 18th Division was responsible for defending the entirety of Norfolk, and then you had the 54th Division to the south defending this area of like pretty much Lowestoft to Harwich. I can't remember if I've got the 54th Division war diary. I'm fairly certain I have somewhere, but I just wanted to focus on the 18th Division because their information was fresh in my mind through recently writing a blog about their initial deployment. So, what did their war diary say? So, in October 1939, their war diary kind of summarises what is put in the Julius Caesar plan, and it says here, that the latest situation is given in War Office and Home Forces instructions has been outlined. It doesn't refer to the Julius Caesar plan, but that's what it's referring to. And this gives details, on the likely forces likely to be encountered, as we've seen earlier in this video. But it says here, interestingly, that these will not be disclosed. That's very interesting. I'm not sure why. But it summarises here that the probable action of the enemy is that they will occupy a landing ground to extend the efforts by airborne troops landing on the aerodrome and seize a port for disembarkation. So this again summarises the Julius Caesar plan quite succinctly. And it also explains here that there's also likely to be significant intensive bombing of centres of communication and headquarters. And it also again parrots here that the landing on open beaches is unlikely except in the calmest of weather. So this is the situation in October 1939, kind of in contrast or in line with what the Julius Caesar plan outlines. And then coming into December 1939, we have here a summary of the choice of actions or the choice of operations, as it's termed here, of what the enemy might do. So again, this summarises that it's likely that armed soldiers will be dropped by parachutes. Armed forces will be equipped by troop-carrying aeroplanes. And again, intense bombing of military objectives and centres of communication. And then raids or actual landing of armed forces on the coast. So again, tying in with this, what the revised Julius Caesar plan was saying. Also interesting here is that it makes mention of naval raids or tip and run. Sorry, you're not going to see my inverted commas. Tip and run raids. So that is either quickly landing troops on a coast, dicking around, and then re-embarking them and sodding off, or bombing coastal areas, or bombarding. Sorry, is the word I'm after. Yeah, so it's interesting here that they mention these coastal raids or naval raids on selected ports and coast town, potentially as a diversion to an invading force or something like that. So yeah, I just find it interesting how you see, the Julius Caesar plan at the top, and then you see how this information filters down and is then changed at a division level to suit local requirements, for example. So it's interesting. I thought to give you that perspective of how this information was correlated and assessed at the command level and also at the division level from one of the divisions in this area where invasion was seen as most likely. Right. So just to kind of summarise, initially in October 1939, the Julius Caesar plan outlined that an invasion force was likely to focus around the ports of Humber, on the Humber or Harwich, with an enemy force being dropped to capture that first, and then enemy shipping or troop transports being dropped to capture these ports and then used as a supply port of supply. And there was also the potential that other ports such as Aberdeen, Dundee, Lowestoft or Ramsgate could also be captured and used as for the invasion. So just as a summary. Then coming into December 1939, this projection was revised significantly, with the port of Harwich being determined to be the most likely of invasion, and the area of coast between Yarmouth and Harwich being the most likely place which the Germans are going to drop troops. Also, there was some assessment here that it's potential that the Germans could make landfall somewhere between the Humber and the Thames, sailing within 12 to 14 hours from northern Germany, and then also some scope for additional landing or unexpected landings in an area from the Tyne all the way down to Harwich. So again, we've seen this initial plan drafted, and then that is kind of refined following the a reassessment of data. And this is something that continues throughout this invasion threat period, and something that I'll highlight further in this video. So showing you that the invasion threat, as it was perceived from the Home Forces, wasn't fixed, it changed over time, and this is the perspective from the defenders, not the invaders, which is something that's very rarely shown. So hopefully that video is giving you kind of like an insight into the initial perspective or perception of invasion as it was seen from the Home Forces in the early days of the Second World War, in this period from October 1939 to early 1940. I think that's about, as I like to say, that's enough for one day. This video is coming in about 35 minutes, which is by and large what I like to keep my videos to. So hopefully you found that useful. Hopefully this will get you thinking more about how the defenders reacted to the various threats of invasion. If you haven't done so already, watch video 1 in this series, because it's well worth getting an idea of the actual threats of invasion from the German side. But I think that covers everything I want to cover this time. Just to kind of finish off, if you want to find out more and support my research, you can do through Patreon. So my Patreon supporters get early previews of videos like this one, so generally 24 hours before I release these videos, I put them on Patreon, and my Patreons get to see them before anyone else. And for £5 a month, you can help support my research. You can get an insight into what goes on behind the scenes in terms of my research, and get a better idea of some of the things I'm finding out. Or if you want to just make a one-off donation, then you can do via Ko-Fi. So again, any money is gratefully received. It helps me to make video content like this. And at the minute, it also helps to fund me sourcing documents from the National Archives, which I can then use to get a better understanding of the Home Forces and produce videos like this one, which outline the actual situation of invasion during the Second World War. So at this point, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that's been useful. If you've got any questions or comments, post them in the comment section below. Yeah, and the next video is going to look at the situation in 1940 specifically, and we're going to see how things changed considerably in that period. So as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.